He only wanted to stay for one night. No names, no stories. But in that wooden house on the hill, where the dinner table had one empty seat, where the mute girl stitched clothes in silence, his past refused to stay buried, and the last bullet was the very thing that made him stay. The wind blew across the cracked land, carrying red dust as quietly as ash from a long dead fire. No more birds took flight, no figures walked among the withered grass barely up to one's shin. In the dying light of sunset, the land looked like the sun itself was fading on the back of a gaunt horse. Jonas Wade rode without hurry, his body leaned slightly forward, one hand loosely holding the reins, eyes not watching the trail but occasionally flicking toward the parched cacti flanking him. The saddle was worn, the leather cracked in web-like patterns, like the back of a man who'd sat there through too many seasons without ever changing it. His wide-brimmed hat cast half his face in shadow, but one thing was still clear. This was not the posture of someone heading towards something. It was of a man leaving something behind. Up ahead, the hill began to rise, smooth and silent, like a mound of earth someone once tried to bury something in. Something that wasn't quite dead. Atop the hill, a small wooden house nestled beneath the low clouds. Golden light seeped from the window pane, trembling like a lantern nearly out of oil. Jonas tightened the reins slightly. The horse halted, snorting from its pale, muzzled nose. He said nothing to it. Never did. They had journeyed through 3 dry regions, 2 hunting seasons, and 1 freezing night near the Utah border that nearly took their lives. The wind picked up again. That late-season wind, dry, scorched with the scent of earth, like the breath of someone left behind. Jonas pulled his coat closer at the collar, more from habit than for warmth. He didn't know how long he'd paused. Before signaling the horse to move again, his eyes drifted once more toward the house. That yellow light made no promises nor threats. It simply existed like a period in a sentence far too crowded with commas. Maybe a place to rest, maybe an ending. The horse resumed its pace, hooves clunking dully against a ground too dry to echo. An owl glided past without a sound, without casting a shadow. I'm not looking for anything, just need one night's sleep before I go farther. His voice echoed faintly in his mind, not quite a declaration, nor a confession, but as if reminding himself to breathe. A few fir trees began to appear along the dirt path leading up the hill, their leaves black as freckles inked onto the gray sky, their trunks bowed like shoulders burdened too long. In the wind, a scrap of old newspaper fluttered across the ground and landed near the horse's hooves. An unread headline, a world no one waited for anymore. Jonas didn't bother picking it up. He let the horse step over it, the way he'd stepped over everything in life. Slow, steady, without looking back. The house was closer now. The lamplight cast the window frame in sharper relief, and a faint silhouette stood behind the glass. Unmoving, unyielding, Jonas halted before the porch. The wind had stopped, as if the world itself waited to see if he'd knock. He raised his hand, slowly. 3 knuckles tapped softly on the weathered wood. The sound didn't echo, just a brief beat between 2 long silences. One night, one roof, a place where the past wouldn't follow. That was all. But he didn't know, or not yet, that inside that house, no one was waiting for a man to sleep the night. They were waiting for someone who would stay. The hinge creaked, not because the door hadn't been opened in a long time, but as if the door itself hesitated, unsure whether it should let him in. The light from inside the house spilled out, soft and pale, like a thin mist draped over an old quilt. The woman who opened the door stood there, not old, but looking as though time had chosen her to pass more slowly than everywhere else. Her dark hair was neatly tied at the nape with a strip of fabric. Her eyes neither questioned nor showed surprise, just looked as if someone were gently brushing a hand across a book that had been read many times. "Come in, it's getting cold." She didn't ask who he was, didn't ask where he came from, didn't ask how long he'd be staying. Jonas froze for a moment. He wasn't used to kind silence. It had been too long since someone opened a door for him without pointing a gun or holding out a hand for money. He stepped inside, slowly, as if entering a space where one wrong step could shatter everything. The house was small. The scent of wood smoke and rosemary lingered faintly. Wooden walls, lamplight, a round wooden table at the center, a fireplace with embers nearly out. On the floor, faint footprints, visible enough to notice but not to follow. In the corner of the room, beneath the golden light, a girl of about 12 was sewing a flax shirt. Small hands, long, slender fingers, her movements precise, as if someone had taught her from a very young age. She didn't look up when he entered, but her fingers had stopped. The needle froze mid-stitch. The light caught the crooked tie of her hair, suggesting someone who had lived through more than her years allowed. No greeting, no glance, just stillness, enough for Jonas to hear the sound of his own breathing. He stood motionless, hat still on. He didn't yet know what to ask, or if he should ask anything at all. The air inside didn't make him feel welcome, nor did it make him feel rejected. It felt like a room where someone had long since passed, and those who remained had learned to preserve everything, as if they never left. The girl picked the needle up again, silently, continued sewing, but Jonas saw her fingers tremble, not out of fear, but as though her body was reacting to something familiar, yet foreign. The woman, Miriam, gestured toward the chair near the fireplace. No words were needed. The motion was gentle enough not to break the quiet, yet firm enough for him to understand. He could sit, but shouldn't ask much. Jonas set his bag down. The brass clasp made a soft clink against the floor. The girl stitched the final line, then folded the shirt and set it aside. Her eyes met his. For just a second, light gray eyes, not innocent, not hardened, just still. Not a single word was spoken for the rest of the evening, and yet something, whether trust or doubt, began to thicken in the air. A man stepped into a stranger's house just to sleep, but the way the three of them shared silence made him feel as if he had wandered into a place not meant for words, but for those too tired to explain. And for the first time in a very long while, Jonas realized perhaps he wasn't the only one carrying a story without a name. The kitchen at Rose's Rest wasn't large, just enough for one person to turn, another to pour water, and a third to sit quietly and watch. Jonas sat where he was shown, a rough wooden chair by the fireplace whose coals had burned down, his dust-covered boots still on. Sweat still marked his back from the saddle, and the scent of earth clung to every crease in his clothes, but he didn't rush to rise. No one urged him to. Miriam was setting dinner. She didn't ask what he'd like to eat. She didn't tell him to come to the table. She simply laid out one more portion, as if tonight's supper had always meant to serve four, and he had merely arrived on time. On the table, a bowl of red bean soup, lightly steaming with the spicy scent of desert chili, a piece of cornbread with cracked edges, reheated, not fresh but not yet dry, a cup of black tea placed slightly far to the left, as if for someone left-handed, Jonas noticed, and that made him pause a moment before reaching for the spoon. The other three place settings had already been laid out, one for Miriam, one for the girl, Annie, who now sat tucked at the edge of the table, not eating, just watching the steam rise and disappear into the air. The third set, still clean, still untouched, still shining as if someone had just wiped it down with a fresh cloth. Jonas didn't ask. And that was the first time in years he realized some empty places are not meant to be filled, only accepted. The kitchen was warm but not stifling. The scent of herbs lingered so faintly it felt more like memory than actual fragrance, as if someone had cooked here for many years, and the kitchen simply kept their scent so it wouldn't forget they once existed. Esther, Miriam's mother, appeared at the kitchen doorway. No footsteps, no heavy breath. She stood there, watching Jonas for a long moment. No greeting, no question. Her clouded eyes, thin silver hair brushed back with a worn wooden comb. She set down a jar of salt, nodded once, out of habit or duty, then turned and walked out without making a sound. Jonas lowered his head toward the first spoonful of soup, a bit salty, but warm and real, not like the flavors from the stagecoach diner meals. This was the kind of food people made when they'd survived winters too long and were still here. Annie still didn't eat, but her eyes followed his hand, every small motion, every time he set the spoon down. Not exactly cautious, not quite curious, more like she was trying to see whether he was a man, or just another part of the darkness. Miriam folded napkins silently. There were 3 in the stack, now 4, 1 extra for the guest, but not an old one, not for cleanliness, but for unspoken courtesy, just like how she didn't ask about the rusted gun in his bag, didn't ask where he came from, and didn't pretend not to see the scar poking out beneath his sleeve. Someone once said, "A place that sets a plate for you without asking your name is either very kind or very weathered." Jonas figured this place might be both. Outside, the wind whispered faintly at the doorframe, like someone murmuring behind the wooden walls, but inside, everything stayed still, like a living photograph. Jonas ate slowly, not because of hunger, but to hold on to the flavor, as if holding on to something that wouldn't be found again elsewhere. And in that moment, a strange feeling stirred within him, the sense that he was no longer a guest, but someone who had returned from a place where no one had waited. Night didn't fall by color, but by silence. Jonas lay on a narrow iron-framed bed, painted brown, its old mattress sunken soft, the sheets still holding the scent of hand-washed soap. The room was small, its wooden walls tightly joined, the ceiling low. There was nothing in it but a nightstand and a dim oil lamp casting yellow light. No photos, no books, no trace of memory. Outside the window, the wind began to change its voice. At dusk, it had only whispered, like a hand gently brushing over a tired forest. Now it grew harsh, hissing in long streams across the wooden roof, like the sound of someone sighing and no one listening. Jonas lay on his side, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't used to sleeping in quiet. For years he had slept among the sounds of whinnying horses, distant gunfire, bar fights, and the deep churn of a windmill at the last ranch he ever owned. But tonight there was nothing. Nothing except the wind, and then, layered within that wind, another sound, very faint, very steady, footsteps, not an adult's, smaller steps, tiptoeing across the wooden boards of the porch, the steps of someone who knew every plank, knew where they creaked and where they didn't. Jonas didn't sit up. He only tilted his head, eyes following the lamplight, seeping through the door's edge. The footsteps stopped. A small shadow moved just behind the curtain, not hiding but not wanting to be seen either. There was no sense of danger, no intent, only attention. Moments later, the door eased open. It was Annie. She wore an oversized flax coat and held a folded thin blanket in her arms. Her boots were mud-smeared, hair fallen across one shoulder. She didn't look into the room, just walked past. Jonas didn't call out. He let his eyes follow the girl as she crossed to the front yard, where his horse stood tethered under a rough lean-to. The wind still howled, but the horse was quiet, unmoving. Annie approached, without fear, without rush. She raised her hand and gently stroked the horse's neck, then laid the blanket across its back. The motion was clumsy but firm, like she had done it many times before, with some other horse, for some other man, who had once slept here, or stayed forever. Jonas sat up, but didn't go out. He didn't want to disturb the moment, a small stranger tending to the animal of an older stranger, without asking why. Only a few minutes. Then Annie retreated, as quietly as she came, no glance toward the window, no wait for thanks, no need to be noticed. Sometimes kindness doesn't live in words or glances. It lives in the quiet doing of something good, unasked, unwitnessed, unpraised. Jonas lay back down. The light still glowed yellow, faint, but the room no longer felt vacant. The space was no longer hollow, even though nothing in it had changed. The wind still howled above the roof, but now it no longer sounded like someone sighing. It sounded like someone keeping watch, soft, steady, unmoving. By morning, the wind had shifted. It no longer howled across the roof, but slid sideways over the hill, like a snake seeking sun. The first light of day filtered through the cracks in the window, catching the dust that hung in the air, casting a dull, amber glow like old whiskey, rippling but incapable of intoxication. Jonas opened his eyes before the rooster crowed. The room was unchanged, nothing disturbed, no sound but the creak of wood tightening against the chill. He sat up, pulled on his coat. The morning aches in his back returned, a quiet reminder that age doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. From the window he saw his horse still there, the old blanket on its back neatly tucked at the corners. Something inside his chest loosened, not pain, not sorrow, just softness, like a shirt left too long in the sun, warm to the touch, but only from the memory of heat long gone. Jonas stepped into the hallway. The house was slowly filling with light, but no one spoke. Miriam had been up early, carrying a bucket of water she'd just drawn from the porch. Esther sat by the window, her fingers slipping over a strand of wooden prayer beads, lips murmuring sounds without shape. Only Annie was nowhere to be seen. Jonas meant to head outside when Esther spoke, for the first time, after all the silences of the night before. Her voice came like an old rope drawn tight around a door. Pull it once and every rusted hinge shudders. People who carry ghosts with them, they don't sleep deep. Jonas froze. He didn't turn, didn't reply. Only his breath shifted pace, as if her words had landed on something buried too deep for even him to name. Esther said no more. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the sky beyond the window, where the clouds sank low, brushing against the tree line. Jonas stepped outside, not hurried, but certain. He passed through the back garden, where a few vegetable beds lay under rough tarps, and where Annie crouched, sketching something in the dirt with a broken stick. She didn't look up, as always. But this time Jonas came closer, no longer watching from afar. He knelt down, eyes following the drawing, a man on horseback, riding through the desert, and behind him a long shadow, longer than the horse, longer than the man. That shadow was shaped like a woman, head bowed. Jonas swallowed hard. His heart beat slow but clear. He didn't ask what she was drawing, but he understood. She didn't know him, but she saw him, saw what he himself had always avoided facing: guilt. Once, long ago, he left home just to find a stray cow. When he returned, his wife was gone. Complications in labor, winter, no one to help. And the baby girl, not even 3 months old, didn't survive the night. Jonas stood, quietly turned away. He said nothing to Annie. She kept drawing, as if that was the only way she knew how to listen to the world. When he reached the porch again, Miriam was there. She didn't ask where he'd gone, didn't ask what he saw. She simply left the door open. Not exactly an invitation, not quite a dismissal. In the early cold, the old house no longer held the silence of the night before. It now had a small fracture from a blind old woman's truth-spoken whisper. But that crack didn't break the house. It just let in a little light, soft, just enough. The room was still the same. The simple wooden bed, golden light slanting in through the window, dust floating like ash that had yet to settle. No one had entered since the night before, and nothing in the house suggested anyone would if he didn't choose to leave. Jonas sat down on the edge of the bed. His hands rested on a faded canvas bag, the kind that had followed him through more than a dozen states. From nameless towns to way stations, no one bothered rebuilding. He didn't open it right away, just kept his hands there a long while, the way an old man might pet the back of a dog long gone, living now only in memory. Outside, the wind slipped through the wooden slats, soft as the sound of bare feet crossing a porch. But no one came. No one asked. And so, he opened the bag. There was nothing unexpected inside. A rusted folding knife, the blade worn thin as paper, an old shirt neatly folded, but long unworn, a thick leather notebook with only the first 4 pages written, and a small photograph. Jonas picked up the photo, his hands trembling not from cold. It was so old the corners were torn, the color yellowed, the paper soft as silk. In the picture, a young woman cradling a newborn, eyes looking toward the lens as if frightened, but still believing somehow that this moment would be preserved forever. But no one preserved it, and that moment hadn't lasted long enough to become a full memory. Jonas ran his thumb gently over the image, a habit he could never shake, as if the gesture could somehow undo mistakes no longer allowed correction. Then, from the bottom of the bag, he pulled out an old revolver. It was wrapped in deep blue velvet tied with a thin rope. He laid it across his lap, gazed at it, didn't remove the cover, didn't check the chamber. He just looked, the way one looks at something that should no longer be kept, but can't yet be let go. The gun hadn't fired in over 3 years, but it had never left his side. It wasn't a reminder of who he used to be, but of what he'd done when he was no longer anyone at all. Inside the notebook was a half-burned letter, brown paper, a woman's handwriting, uneven and slanted, hurried as if written in the throes of labor. Only the final line remained unscorched. Don't come back again. But if you ever truly loved me, don't let the child die cold like her mother. Jonas closed the notebook. The fire had burned part of it once, but the embers still smoldered in his eyes, and the cold that child once felt. Sometimes he still felt it too, whenever he lay in the forest, inside a sleeping bag, even in summer. He lit the lamp, pulled out the letter, placed it on a small iron plate on the table, and lit it again. This time he burned it all. No remnants, no smoke, only the smell of ash, blended with the scent of old leather and the damp musk of long-kept memory. Jonas stood up. The gun remained untouched, still wrapped, but now it felt a little lighter, not because it had lost weight, but because something bound to it had just been set free. Out in the yard, the horse let out a quiet whinny, not harsh, not startled, as if it had just woken from a dream that wasn't bad. In the room, no one knocked, no one asked. And it was exactly that. That made this the first place in years where Jonas felt he could finally set his bag down. The afternoon passed as quietly as if time itself were walking barefoot across the earth. The sun dipped behind the far slope of the hill, leaving behind a streak of orange and rose smeared across the clouds, like old blood that no wash could ever cleanse. In the backyard, Miriam tended a fire under the bean pot. Esther peeled purple onions one by one, and Jonas chopped wood. He hadn't been asked. He hadn't offered. He had simply seen the axe and the stacked logs by the porch and walked over. Hands that had once held reins, a revolver and a pen, now gripped the axe as if they had never left the forest or the shelter of a weathered roof. No one said anything, but this time the silence wasn't distant. It was the kind of silence shared among people who've long since learned how to share space without needing permission. Just before sunset, Annie appeared. She stepped out from the kitchen porch, hands holding something wrapped in rough cloth. Her small boots brushed the ground so lightly not a single leaf stirred. She stopped in front of Jonas. No words, no gesture, just held out her hands. Jonas looked up, then slowly reached out to receive it. A small, cold, heavy object lay in his palm. A bullet, an old one, not new, but polished. Its surface gleamed so bright it caught the deep hue of the twilight sky. Wrapped around the bullet was a piece of paper, rolled tight and bound with a strand of blue thread. Jonas unwrapped it. On the paper, a simple drawing, a house with a sloped roof, smoke curling from its chimney, and in front, a man standing next to a horse, and a little girl. No words, no message, just one image. And one bullet. Jonas closed his hand gently around the gift, then looked at Annie. She still said nothing, but this time her eyes did not turn away. In them he no longer saw the fear or wariness from their first meeting. He saw something he hadn't dared believe he might still be worthy of. Trust. Sometimes a bullet is not meant to kill. It's given to someone like a key to a door that's gone too long without a knock. Jonas didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He only nodded, a slow, firm nod, like driving a stake into the earth to mark a place that one day could be returned to. Annie turned away, not waiting for a reaction. She walked toward the back garden where the stray cat often wandered beneath the banana trees. Jonas looked down at the bullet in his hand, small but heavy, not because of the metal, but because of what it represented. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, near his heart, not because he planned to use it, but because he needed to carry it, like a promise no one ever asked him to keep, but only those who've done wrong know how priceless such a promise can be. The sun had just set, leaving behind a jagged red scar on the edge of the sky, like a wound that hadn't yet closed. The sky wasn't fully dark, just dim enough for the storm lantern inside the house to begin glowing. A murky light that made everything look as if it were breathing. Miriam was setting the table. On the porch, Esther pulled hay from a basket, prepping the chicken coop. Annie sat in the corner, sketching something no one could see. Jonas stood near the fireplace, his hands still smudged from the afternoon's woodpile. The peace was so quiet, it felt suspicious. Then came the sound of hooves, not one, three, not hurried, not rushed, just the calm clop of men who knew the door would be opened. Miriam froze mid-motion. Esther looked up. Jonas didn't move, but his hand slipped away from the brick wall, drifting slowly toward his belt where the old revolver still slept. 3 knocks, measured, not loud, not soft, as if it was the ones inside who had reason to be afraid. Miriam stepped forward to open the door. She didn't ask, "Who is it?" She didn't look back at Jonas. The door cracked open and the light inside spilled out across the threshold like a thin line of honey. 3 men stood there. One tall, shaggy like wild cattle, smiling with his eyes but hands tucked in his coat. One shorter, wearing a Mexican-style cap, chewing a dry stalk of straw. And the third, the one in the center, looked the most ordinary, but felt the coldest. He wore a brown leather coat, a faint scratch across the chest like something clawed it. The man smiled, tipped his hat. "Sorry to trouble you, ma'am, just need a little water. That dusty trail's baked our throats like clay tiles." Miriam didn't smile. But she didn't shut the door either. "Well's out back. Water's cold." The one with the cap nodded and headed around the side. The tall one stayed still, his eyes fixed on Jonas even though he hadn't spoken a word. And the man in the center, he didn't look at anyone until his gaze landed on Jonas. A long silence, not hostile, not warm, just the look of someone seeing a shadow from the past. Then, with a voice smooth as dust, "Jonas Wade." "Still alive, huh?" Jonas didn't reply, didn't step forward, didn't step back, but Miriam, for the first time, turned to look at him. The man kept speaking, voice even, cold. "I remember your wife. She used to work the dirt with her bare hands, like she was stroking it, not planting anything." The room chilled, not from wind, but from a name spoken aloud, a name no one inside had ever dared to say. Esther didn't stand, but her hand slowly moved toward her skirt, where a small paring knife was always tucked at her hip. Annie was already behind her. No one had noticed when. Her face showed no fear, only confusion. Jonas still said nothing, but his gaze changed. No anger, no trembling, just a dark wave rising behind his eyes like black water creeping into a deep well. Miriam shut the door, not fast, not forceful, just firmly enough to keep the darkness on the porch from crossing the threshold. Outside, the footsteps faded, unhurried like wolves that didn't need to lunge. They knew when to come back. The meat would be softer. In the kitchen, the fire crackled softly. Esther remained seated, but her eyes stayed locked on the door. Miriam lowered her head and gathered the bowls. No questions, no complaints. Only Annie quietly stepped toward Jonas and handed him the drawing she'd been working on, a house and a wolf, standing at the doorstep. Behind the door, a shadow, holding a gun. Night settled in. The wind changed direction, now blowing in from the hills, carrying the damp scent of scorched grass and something else, the smell of horsehide mixed with dying tobacco. The house was sealed shut, but no one slept. The fire in the kitchen still burned, not for cooking, but to remind the living they were still alive. Miriam sat silently by the stove, her hand resting close to a pot of thick black coffee. Beside her sat a small gas can, its cap still tightly sealed. Jonas stood in the corner of the room, not leaning, not seated, just standing. His hand touched the gun inside his coat, but he hadn't drawn it. The bullet Annie had given him still lay in the inner pocket, and now he might have to use it. Esther quietly motioned him out onto the porch. The door closed behind them, and the sound of night settled like a mist across their shoulders. The old woman didn't waste time. "You can run. We're not keeping you." Jonas looked at her, not surprised, not guarded. Esther squinted back toward the kitchen inside. "I'm old. My daughter's stubborn. But the girl, Annie, she doesn't know anything beyond this house. If you leave, no one will blame you. But if you stay, don't stand on the sidelines when blood starts spilling." Wind swept beneath the porch eaves, lifting the smell of earth and smoke. Jonas still said nothing, but his hand pressed against the old railing, as if testing how much more weight it could bear. Esther turned and went back inside. No added words, no threats, only the kind of truth left sitting on the table like a knife, and anyone who picks it up will bleed. In the kitchen, Miriam was stoking the fire. The flames had turned, no longer gold, but tinged pale green. That strange light flickered across her face, and in that moment Jonas saw the shape of the wife he'd lost. The same furrowed brow counting each piece of firewood, the same slight tilt of posture to the left, a childhood habit carried into womanhood. And he remembered. He had left when his wife had just lit the fire, and returned only when the flame was gone, and the house was nothing but ash. Jonas turned, intending to walk out to the stable. But then came the faint clatter. The back door creaked open. Annie. She stepped in, holding 2 small wooden cups. One she handed to him. The other she placed beside the gas can. No words, no pleading look, just a quiet gesture, as if she'd long grown used to people arriving and people leaving and only objects staying behind. Jonas looked down at the cup of coffee in his hand. It was hot, bitter, but inside it was something he hadn't found anywhere in all these years. Trust that didn't need to be earned. The fire cracked in the kitchen hearth, and for the first time in this story, Jonas sat down, not from fatigue, but because he knew that if he stood again and stepped across that threshold, something inside him would die again. And this time, for good. That night, it didn't rain, but the wind rose, each gust cutting across the old porch planks like blades drawn slow through splinters. Miriam bolted the front door. Esther whispered to Annie, telling her to stash the drawings, the ones she hadn't finished, in the hollow beneath the bed. Jonas sat by the window, eyes fixed on the thick darkness gathering along the ridge. No one said they were coming, but everyone knew they were. This time, the hoofbeats didn't hide. Footsteps followed, boots striking gravel, heavy, firm, deliberate. Metal clinked against metal. Weapons or just belt buckles, no one bothered to tell. No one needed to. A man's voice rose from beyond the door. "Jonas Wade, I think you'd best come out here, before that mute girl ruins the party." No one answered, but Annie, standing near the back door, shuddered, not out of fear, but because she knew that voice. Jonas looked to Esther. She gave a small nod, then walked straight to the kitchen, gripping the heavy kettle in both hands. Not tea, not water, just boiling, fresh off the fire. Annie began backing away. Miriam reached to pull her in, but at that moment the side window shattered. A figure lunged through, quick as a wolf in a chicken coop. The one in the Mexican cap, young, fast, bloodthirsty. He grabbed Annie, tried to drag her out of the room. Esther didn't scream. She threw the kettle, a two-handed throw, like slamming a stone at a snake. Steam burst through the air. His scream tore through the house. Miriam yanked open a kitchen drawer, pulled out an old six-shot revolver, its ivory grip cracked with age. The man spun around, but before he could act, the gun fired. Jonas had pulled the trigger. No shaking, no hesitation. He fired with the bullet Annie had given him. That bullet, the one polished smooth, once wrapped in a sketch of a little house, now cut through the air like a declaration. I stayed. The man dropped, blood spilling fast across the patch of floor where Esther once sowed spring herbs. The silence that followed was not like the silence before. It was heavier, deeper, as if the house had just swallowed a wild thing and was now waiting to see if any others would dare follow. Jonas exhaled, not deeply, but enough, like a man who'd just cleared a boulder from his lungs after carrying it for years. Annie crawled out from the corner, not crying. She picked up the spent bullet, now scratched, dirt-stained. She didn't wipe it. She just held it tight, not as a weapon, but as a memory. Someone had chosen to stay because of her. Miriam looked at Jonas, and for the first time her eyes held no suspicion, no defense, no reservation. Jonas laid the gun on the table. Then he sat down beside the broken window, his back against the wall. His eyes turned outward toward the night, where the other wolves hadn't come charging in, but surely weren't gone for good. The wind passed through the hallway like an uninvited guest, flinging the back door open and closing it again with a sigh. Blood still stained the floor tiles. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, sharp, dry, but not malicious. It didn't overpower the scent of cinnamon, which Miriam had just added to the kettle. A habit of someone no longer here. No one rushed to clean up. Esther simply draped a cloth over the man who had fallen, didn't ask his name, didn't retrieve the bullet. Just a simple cloth across the face. Quiet, unadorned, as if she'd done this before. many times. Miriam kept steeping the tea. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured water into the pot, but her eyes never left the stove, where the flame burned steady as though no shot had ever echoed through the walls. Annie sat down beside Jonas. No hug, no words. She simply opened her palm, the bullet still resting in her small hand, her fingernails rimmed with ash and dirt. Jonas looked at it. It wasn't a bullet anymore, but a metal reminder. He hadn't walked away. He placed his hand gently on her head, not stroking her hair, not pulling her in. Just a touch, like a dry branch resting against a broken trunk. In the corner of the room, Esther washed her hands in cold water. The grime slid away, but the fracture in her eyes remained. That boy couldn't have been 30, nothing in his eyes but hunger, but his soul had been dead a long time. No one replied, but they all understood. Out here there are those who grow up in dust and blood, so deeply steeped in it that if they ever stopped moving, they'd crumble straight into sand. Jonas stood, walked to the shattered window, the place he had fired from. He bent down, picked up a shard of broken glass, held it to the lamplight. A single drop of blood still clung to the edge. He wiped it away with the edge of his shirt, not to erase it, but as if to keep the feeling. For the first time in years, he had chosen to stand on the side of the weaker. Outside on the porch, the wind carried the cry of a strange bird, sharp, almost like a summons, or a warning. Jonas looked out toward the field. No more figures, no more wolves, just a rolling hill brushed with grass and the scent of dust folding into moonlight. Annie approached the door, still holding the bullet. She placed it on the table beside the tea bowl Miriam had just poured. No one told her to, but in that small motion there was something that felt like a ritual. The fire burned lower. The kitchen grew warmer. No one ate, but no one was hungry. And in that brief moment, amid the cinnamon, the tea steam, and a single blood-stained tile, they were no longer just temporary dwellers, but a family that had survived its first storm. The next morning there was no rain, no sun either, just a thin veil of mist, like the slow breath of someone who had just fallen back asleep after a nightmare. Jonas rose early, not from the crow of roosters. This house kept no chickens, but because he couldn't sleep. His back ached, the old ache of a man who had once fallen off a horse and lived. But this morning, that pain didn't make him want to leave. He stepped onto the porch. The old wooden chair was still there. Its back curved downward on one side, as if it had borne years of westbound winds. On the table sat a wooden bowl. Inside, a handful of iron nails and a small hammer. No one told him, no one asked, but Jonas understood. The leaning porch had to be fixed. So he began, not quickly, not noisily, each nail driven in slowly, firmly, as if every strike of the hammer was a quiet vow. I'm staying, at least for today. Annie appeared at the window, her hair tangled, a pencil in her hand. She didn't call, she didn't step outside, she just sat within and drew. A while later she slipped the sheet of paper beneath the door, then disappeared. Jonas picked it up, a sketch of 4 figures, himself, Annie, Miriam, and a newly rebuilt porch. No color, no faces, just plain shapes, and one unmistakable feeling. This is what she believed in. Jonas folded the paper, tucked it into his chest pocket, beside the old letter he once meant to burn. Now, he no longer wanted to. In the kitchen, Miriam wasn't boiling coffee. Instead, she was wiping down the table, pulling out cornmeal, preparing to make cornbread. No one said a word, but the way she scrubbed her hands more carefully than usual, the way Esther gathered the trash and walked farther than she needed to throw it away, all of it said one thing: they didn't want to live the old way anymore. No wind chime rang that morning. The hook was still there, the string still held. Only The chime had fallen in the windstorm the night before, but softly, in the muted light of the new day, the rhythm of the hammer, slow, steady, rose into the air like the beat of a heart coming back. Evening settled over the hillside, no longer heavy with the scent of gunpowder. Only the wind passed through the newly mended porch, tapping lightly on the wood as if to test whether the one who fixed it had done it right. Jonas stood behind the house, sleeves rolled up, bent over the woodpile. No orders, no request. Just a sense that some wood needed splitting, the kind of thing a man does when he lives in a house. In the kitchen, Esther no longer scowled at him. She washed the dishes, left the door open, letting the evening light in. And for a moment, Jonas's shadow cast across the wall as if it had always belonged there. Miriam quietly gathered beans, preparing supper. She didn't ask where he would go, didn't say he should stay. But when she set the table, she placed a fourth setting, for the first time, without looking at anyone. Annie was drawing again. A new picture. This time she didn't give it to anyone. She taped it to the wall near the kitchen, using burr tape and homemade glue. The drawing showed a scene. 4 people sitting around a table, a hearth fire and a cornbread in the center. Jonas said nothing when he saw it, but that very night he baked cornbread. Not skillfully, not by the book. The batter was a bit runny, the crust a little burnt, but the smell was exactly like what his wife used to make years ago in a cabin by the river. Annie didn't leave a single crumb. Esther chewed slowly. Miriam looked at him, didn't smile, but her gaze was softer than any other day. Jonas didn't ask the price of a room. He didn't pay. But that night, he brought a blanket out to the porch and laid it down beneath the new roof. He lay there, watching the moon through the leaves, listening to the insects hum like a tune he'd once forgotten. His chest no longer felt tight. His shoulders no longer braced like someone expecting a shot from behind. No one asked him to stay. No one asked where he planned to go. But now he himself didn't know when he would leave. And maybe he didn't need to know. That morning the fog hung low, like an old blanket someone forgot to fold. There were no hoofbeats. No one headed for the fields. Only the breath of the earth, heavy, warm, and full of quiet meaning. Jonas woke early. He no longer slept on the porch. The night before, when Miriam noticed the cold creeping in, she opened the door, just opened it. She didn't call, and he, as if hearing a signal carried on the wind, stepped inside, bringing with him the thick blanket no one had touched in a long time. The house now held 4 breaths, no more words than before, no fewer silences, but something had changed. Jonas stood on the doorstep. In his hands was an old shirt, once worn by Miriam's late husband, a shirt she still washed each month, though no one wore it. Today she had left it out for Jonas, hung beside his own leather hat on the hook near the door. Annie played in the garden, alone as always, but this time the stray cat followed her. It no longer hissed or scratched. It walked quietly beside her, as if it understood that this place was no longer the territory of loneliness. Jonas looked toward the far edge of the yard, where a stone post marked the boundary between the homestead and the wild. He had once thought he'd cross it and never look back, leave nothing behind, but now he no longer needed a line in the dirt. A voice, soft like someone speaking to themselves or to someone long gone, rose gently in the air. I came here just to sleep for a night, but they gave me something no other place had left, a chance to become the man I never had time to be. Before I missed it, before stepping down from the porch, Jonas saw something resting on the wooden frame where Annie often sat. The bullet, no longer cold steel, it had been polished again, and on its surface someone, maybe Annie, maybe Miriam, had etched a faint mark, the shape of a sloped roof, and beneath it, a crack in the shape of a heart. No one said it aloud, but they all understood. That bullet was no longer meant to kill. It was something kept, a symbol of a choice, of change, of trust misplaced, and then returned to where it belonged. Jonas picked it up, then placed it back on the porch rail and stepped into the house. Behind him, morning light poured through the doorframe. On the floor, the old bloodstain had been scrubbed clean, but the bullet still caught the light. Not like a weapon, like a promise. There are lives that don't need saving, only a place to rest. No grand gestures, no forgiveness, no embrace, just someone setting an extra plate at the table. Jonas Wade was never called a hero. Annie never spoke a word. Miriam didn't cry. Esther never said thank you. But in that house, on that cracked red land where an old bullet gleamed like a relic no longer meant to take life, they gave each other something none of them dared hope for in a lifetime of wandering, a place to be human again. If you've ever gone through days when all you needed was for someone to open a door for you just once, share it in the comments. You don't need to tell the whole story. Just one line is enough to let someone out there feel a little less cold inside.